Welcome back. It's time for Black and White, and today we're focusing on the anniversary of the Dusit attack where 21 Kenyans lost their lives. And joining the conversation today is Loisa Kello, a psychologist, and Henry Kithaiga, who is a Dusit survivor. So you experienced the whole thing, and we are going to take, because we have a psychologist here, we're going to take a look at the effects of this type of attack, because we have suffered a few more attacks earlier this year, and we just want to know, how can people heal? Where are people? The survivors have been talking a lot. Various news agencies have been focusing on this, and it is 1 year on. A lot of healing has taken place physically, but psychologically, a lot of people do not feel like they're there yet. So how can we help them heal? And of course, how can we better understand their plight of survivors as survivors of terrorist attacks? And I'll start with you, Mr. Kithaiga. What was your experience?
Sometimes it's hard to explain because it was a normal day.
And I'm hoping we don't trigger you by taking you back to that particular day. But for the sake of the show, and of course those who want to understand what that day was like for you, I'd like you to go back there.
Yes, that's okay. So I remember it was a normal day, the 15th of January, a Tuesday. We were just starting off the year. At the time, I had not come back to the media. I was working at a company called Red House Public Relations. And at the beginning of the year, what you normally do is you prepare for new business that you want to acquire. So we were working actually on a new business pitch. And I remember going for lunch at around 1 o'clock, meeting up with one of my friends who's also a Dusit survivor. And we had agreed to even have coffee at the restaurant downstairs. But
the one that was the epicenter of the whole thing.
But because it's the beginning of the year and you're planning so much, we had a pitch the next day. I told her, can we do a rain check? I remember going back to the office, and at around 3:30, we had the explosion. And it catches you unaware, but then you also realize the real power of the human mind, because within seconds you process so much. So for me, I was a fire marshal at the time. And having been a former journalist, I knew the difference between an explosion and a gas, because most people thought it was a gas explosion. So the first time I looked outside, I told people, no fire in the air, no heat wave, so that means it must be a bomb. And I tried to clear people from our office. And it's really curious the kind of things people would want to go back for: their phone, their handbag. Everybody, sometimes you think it's a drill. Nobody believes it's a surreal moment. Happening, so then I led people out of our building. I told them we are only using the fire exit. Some people already had used the main stairwell. And as they walked out to the front of the building, they were confronted by the attackers. And because of that, they started coming back into the building, including the guys who used the fire escape. So at that time, I thought I'd gotten quite a number of people out, and I was on my way out myself. And then people told me, no, there are gunshots, let's go back inside. And then we holed up inside a room. And I think what companies need to understand is there are certain measures that we do willingly or unwillingly that tend to impact how staff feel safe during such events. So we walked into our then CEO's office. It had the usual biometric from both the inside and the outside. So we went inside the room. Someone said, close the door. The first person closed, the last person in closed the door. But as it so happened, some of my friends were coming back up the stairs. They were left out of the CEO's office. And it is really a hard moment for you to tell your colleague, we've tried opening the door, we can't open. So you go find somewhere else to hide. You feel as if you're sending them out to the wolves. Sort of die. Sorry, a bit hard to remember. So then while we were inside, we took advantage of the tools we had. I'm a former journalist, so I called my friends in the media. I told them, this is what is happening. Then I also remembered my obligation to my family. Called my brother, told him, your mother cannot find out about this on TV. So you call her, tell her what's happening, walk her through the process. And if I don't make it, just know you are the one who will take over and take care of everything. Called my then girlfriend, who is now my wife, told her what was happening. She thought it was a joke at first, till she saw it on TV.
Because nobody expects this to happen to them.
Or someone they know, you know. And that's one of the most surreal things about yesterday. Because yesterday, a lot of survivors thought there would be, you know, that sort of everybody crying out and saying, oh, what happened to the Dusit survivors? But most of them found themselves sort of alone. They didn't, you know, as much as most of them don't like the attention that comes with it, most of them felt, so I was speaking to some of my colleagues and they felt, oh, everybody seems to have moved on.
Yes.
And it is a recurring theme that you get even from the Westgate survivors and survivors of other attacks. But a word of caution, if you're ever going through an attack, just remember everybody is going through it in a different way.
Right. So
Yes.
could you walk us to the point where you got rescued? How long were you holed up in this particular room, and then what was your saving grace?
Okay. So
Was the room, did the attackers ever make it anywhere close to the room?
Okay. So while we were inside the room, and that's why I mentioned that you must realize that everyone is going through a different experience.
Yeah.
One of my colleagues, their father had been in the cooperative building when the US embassy was blown up. So for him, it was a different experience.
Yeah.
The rest of us are getting calls to tell us, hide, stay safe. He's getting calls to tell him, get out.
Yes.
And his instinct is also get out. And I remember we were hiding in the office we were hiding in, there was a toilet. And so I sequestered him in the toilet and told everybody else just stay outside. Because you could see he's agitated, he's undergoing his own panic attack because it's different for him. For us, this is
It's like
maybe,
history is repeating itself.
Yeah, everybody he talks to tells him, get out. And every instinct in his body tells him, get out. But if he tries to get out, he'd endanger everybody else and himself. So you try to get him to calm down. And that's when you realize that there are also opportunities for you to help others in this sort of attacks. And I'm sure she'll mention later, there are other factors still going through your mind, things like survivor's guilt. And people think survivor's guilt is only after the attack. But for those people who have obligations like fire marshals, security guards, they're the guys who clear the building. So while they're inside seated and they are safe, or they made it out, they were leading a few people out, they still start remembering. For example, I remember myself remembering, what about all those people I told to go out?
Away,
The guys, actually, not even the people you evacuated, did they make it? You know, no one will call you, tell you I made it at this time. So you're thinking, what if I send someone to their death? What if but you are just being reactionary, you're just being... And after the attack, I remember speaking to a psychiatrist and telling them, you know, my biggest fear is that if it happens again, I won't try to help anyone. And it's such an integral part of sometimes who you are. I'm a firstborn. For us, you're always trying to look out for everyone else before you look out for yourself.
Right.
And you feel that during such attacks, you also lose a part of your identity. So I've always thought maybe if an attack could happen again, I'd just run for myself and not care about anyone else, which is really erodes part of you, and you feel there's sort of a conflict within you. So for us, we were inside for about 1 hour, 30 minutes. We were rescued at around 5. But all through that time, luckily, you know, there are 3 reactions to an attack. You'd have flight, freeze, or fight. So different people went through those experiences at the same time. One of my colleagues ran out, and just as they got out, the attackers were coming down. And in that moment, they just froze.
So they didn't keep running?
So they didn't keep running, but because everyone else was running, they nudged them back into action. They scared them. They sort of were able to kickstart her mechanism, and she ran. And our building was the first building. So she ran around the building and tried to come back round it, only to meet other attackers coming down. So she was now torn. Do I run back where I've seen guns?
Seen the others, or should I?
Yeah, this side there are attackers, but also it speaks to being security aware of if an attack happened, where would you run to? Yeah, where do I run to?
You guys who were holed up, how did you get to the point that the attackers were, neutralized? Then you got out, or how was it that you eventually got out? Okay,
so for us, we were holed up in one end of the building, and we, our floor the entire floor belonged to our company.
Yes.
So there were 2 doors, one to each wing. So lucky for us, the last person to walk into our wing closed the glass door. So I remember at some point people being advised barricade the door. And at that point, I tried to sort of get up and look around through the door.
Yes.
And I saw, it was about 7 minutes after the attack had started, the attackers had come back into our wing.
Right.
And I told people, don't push anything, you know, at least we spark, we trigger some, we alert them to our presence. So we were also communicating on the office WhatsApp group. Our colleagues who got out had already gotten in touch with the police, and they were able to know where we were.
So I'd like to bring in Mrs. Okello. When you hear his story, because I'd like the details of the horrors that he went through to come out, what then is the post-traumatic stress, as we hear it being called, that comes with that? And when you listen to all the stories that have been covered about the survivors, you realize that they're not well. And when people make jokes about World War III, they feel like nobody understands how serious this could be. So what is the fallout, psychological fallout from such an attack?
I really want to appreciate and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
It's coming out so real to me because I was one of the lead counselors, both in the Garissa attack and the Dusit.
Okay.
And as he speaks, the reality of what happened, you know, comes in, and it could overwhelm, but I want to simplify it by saying that any human being that is faced with a threat to their life and they are seeing that they may not make it through any situation, it becomes a deep challenge to their mind, and that threat and that situation sort of like continues in their minds and thoughts, and as they walk through, it takes quite a bit of you know, support and assurance for them, for the mind to come back and know that they are now safe.
And what triggers them? Let's say, I've talked about the jokes people are talking about World War III, the people who even call each other al-Shabab. I mean, to others, it's a light thing, but then to most people, these turned out, to those people who survive, this turn into triggers. So what goes through their minds? Maybe they hear an explosion and they cringe like people who have been from war. So what happens in their minds when they're after the attack, when they've survived, they're safe, but then their minds are not there?
Yeah, just like I've said, when any human being is threatened by anything, their life is threatened, so that they get to a place where they actually see like their lives will be
They're going
ended.
to die, basically.
They're going to die.
Yeah.
There's usually that which has threatened their lives. So for him, he said very well, I had the explosion. So the mind registers that threat. And when the mind registers that threat, it becomes very difficult for them to deregister it, get it out of the mind. Was it a bang? Was it a scream? Was it a screech? Was it a cry?
Right.
You know, then the mind registers that so overwhelmingly that because the brain is alive.
You're trying to protect yourself.
Yes, the brain is alive, and so what happened prior to you feeling the threat to your life remains like etched in the brain. And so anything that sounds like that trigger, whether you're safe or 10 years or 5 years later, will always re-trigger, especially if the person has not gone through what we would call a trauma processing. And that's where
what are the steps of this trauma processing?
That's where the issue of trained professionals helping someone out of this situation is becoming such a reality in this time and process. And I know traditionally, even when this happened, there was a way in which somebody would be put through, and they would make sure that person has a support. And they keep, you know, reminding them that they will be safe. And a lot of spirituality was being put into it. And sometimes a lot of explanations were being put into the situation. And that has everything to do with helping this person to come to terms.
Right.
Yes. So it took almost 6 months. 3 months, because we've been working with people who have been involved in that Dusit attack.
Right.
It has taken quite a bit in the Garissa, so it's a process that takes time, but becomes easier when you have a professional supporting you.
Now,
through the
what
process.
about family? Because at the end of the day, they'll be back home, and the family and friends do not probably understand quite well, or maybe they might understand for that week, but then moving on, they might, you know, assume that you're better. So how can they be more aware of how to help survivors?
Yeah, you remember, that's Gedaiga.
Right.
He said something very, very, very important and critical, that whenever there is an attack, whenever there is a trauma or an event like what happens, everybody experiences uniquely because there were underlying issues.
Yeah.
Remember, he's mentioned somebody's father had gone through, and everybody's saying get out, because to them it's like just escape. No, somebody may have gone through any other. Some people, it may have been the very first time that they are going through this. So the entire family, the entire support system has never been in that space before.
Right.
Now, what we do is we usually empower that person to help the people around them understand what does not help them. What they say, what they do, what they take them through, because it is the person who knows what does not work for them.
Yes.
So if they want some peace, they want some space, then it is them that are empowered to really tell someone that I don't like when you joke about this.
Right.
I don't like when you bang doors for this time, because it just triggers me or makes me get scared. And you know, sometimes it is one of the biggest challenge we have with people supporting those who've gone through trauma, is we have become a society that is a little bit carefree in responding to people's needs and feelings, especially this monster called the social media.
Okay.
So you find somebody making a joke out of it, somebody, you know, like looking at the survivor like he is and calling them, you know, referring to them in some unique or some casual way, or the way that is funny, but they do not know the magnitude of trauma and what trauma does. Because if you make any trauma survivor become like they are hopeless, those are some of the things that could lead someone into depression, or they would just then see hopelessness.
Okay, so back to you, Mr. Githaiga. I'd like to read an excerpt from an article on Al Jazeera by several survivors, and just as a conclusion, and it reminds me of the person you are in that room with. This person says, I feel like the government hasn't learned. She said, my mom is a survivor of the Al-Qaeda claimed 1998 U.S. Embassy bombing in Nairobi. I am a survivor of this. More needs to be done. So do you feel that more needs to be done, or are we on the right track?
Yeah, actually, a lot more needs to be done. And it's not just government. Even companies themselves thinking about what happens if this happens to us.
Safety.
Yeah, and even in your own house, there are apartment blocks, there are malls. I think what we've seen over time is an escalation of how terror works.
Yeah.
So now it's in schools, it's gone to our universities, it's gone to buses. So you never really know at what point terror will find you.
Right.
So I think both individuals and companies and then the government need to do something about letting people know what to do in the event of an attack. And then it's also upon you as an individual occasionally to look up in terms of security. And I've seen some of my colleagues, former colleagues, telling me that they'll go into even a nightclub and ask them, where is your fire exit?
Yes, because
where does it lead to? And everybody just tells them, Dusit D2. So they belittle it. But if it happens,
you need to know
where that is.
Yeah. And back to you, Mrs. Okello, as we wind up, I want to know, fear is one of the biggest weapons of terrorist attacks. So how can we guard ourselves from being victims or a scared nation moving forward? Even if you know somebody or you were yourself experiencing this, how can we counter that weapon that is fear?
Wow, that is extremely challenging because especially for survivors and those who are close to the survivors and who experience some of the challenges that people who have survived go through, the best thing that anyone needs to do is to really get a support system.
Right.
And we are coming to a time that the reality of getting professional support for issues that have got to do with mental health, with psychological issues, is really becoming a critical area.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, thank you so much to you both for telling us your story and helping us understand what goes on after such an attack and the PTSD that comes with it. I wish we had more time for this because it's a much deeper, bigger conversation that needs to be had. But we're going to take a short break for now, and when we come back,